Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. New game week ahead for us. New ranking for Penn State. They're up from number 7 to number 4. It was a wild weekend of college football. Really hammered home James Franklin's point of learning in games that you pick up wins from because the top 10 was decimated. We'll talk about, as the dust settles, where that leaves the Nittany Lions moving forward with 7 regular season games ahead. Obviously, that ranking reflects a big jump for them, but a lot of movement across college football when you look at that college football playoff picture. We'll get into that a little bit later, but fresh out of another Beaver Stadium press conference with James Franklin, we welcome back in Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan, my colleagues at Lions247.com. Gentlemen, always good to have you on board. As I said, Penn State's on the rise in those national rankings following a 27-11 victory over the UCLA Bruins. They are 5-0 on the season. As James Franklin has mentioned a couple times here in the last 48 hours or so, they are the only team in college football to open the last 4 seasons with that 5-0 mark. And Mark, as we get you on board for these Monday episodes, we always go back to you and get your thoughts. So what stood out initially coming out of that UCLA matchup as Penn State failed to cover that 4-touchdown spread, but didn't really have to sweat one out at all in Beaver Stadium Saturday afternoon?
Yeah, I gave him a C+ overall for that game, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it proves that you could win relatively easy against an overmatched opponent, even though you're not playing your best game. Defensively, I was looking for ways to really nitpick it, but at the end of the day, the starting defense gives up 3 points, and so what are you going to do? I mean, I don't know how you can, give them anything less than a B. I also like the fact that they really committed to those young defenders on that last drive by UCLA until the very end. I mean, they obviously got some of the starters back in when it got down into the red zone, but I think those reps for guys like Tamir Robinson were just fantastic. And I think it's better rather than holding a team to 3, which they could have done had they left the starters in. I think long-term it's going to be better that those young linebackers, young defensive backs, that some of those younger players got in there and saw reps on that last drive. Offensively, obviously, they weren't able to get the ground game going. I think we have a new appreciation for what the return to the explosiveness of Nick Singleton means to the overall offense. But I also like what Andy Kotelnicki did. He did not go away from the run. I mean, they ran it 30 times and passed it only 24. A key stat from that game, Drew Aller, on passes that went 15 yards or farther in the air, he was 3 of 4 for 107 yards. So what's that telling you? They weren't taking as many deep shots as they probably could have because they were looking to establish other things. And I have absolutely no problem. This wasn't like last year when they were fighting for their lives in games and just would steadfastly refuse to take deep shots. This was knowing something's working. You're winning relatively comfortably and not necessarily going to something that is going to work to improve another area. And I also think what that does, guys, that this offensive line doesn't need confidence because I think it's playing with a lot of confidence, but I think it showed another level of confidence. So even though they weren't breaking off the long runs, this is Kotelnicki and Troutwine saying, we're going to keep running it, guys. I don't care if, what did they end up averaging? It was 2.8 yards.
About 3.2 yards per carry.
Yeah, I mean, if you take out the sacks. But when you saw what Katron Allen was doing on some of those runs where he would get met after 1 or 2 yards and then carry somebody, that to me, and then Venga's big block, I think all of those things were positive. So I had that game at 42-13. I thought Penn State would score more points, but I'm not down on the team at all. I think it's a solid C+ effort, just given the level of competition. And as you said, Tyler, you look around the college football landscape and you see teams dropping games that they have absolutely no business dropping, and you're happy to be 5-0 right now if you're in James Franklin's shoes.
Daniel and I both had the score at 38-6 going into the matchup. Again, Penn State didn't cover that large spread, which was close to 30 points for the game, but 27-3 matchup in the final minute kind of tells the story of where the competitive balance was, especially for the final 3 quarters. And Daniel, we've had a little bit of chance to catch our breath and come up for air and take another look at this matchup since you and I sat down in Beaver Stadium for a post-game podcast on Saturday. So much like Mark, that for the second time with you, anything really starting to rise to the top in terms of takeaways from Game 5?
I think Mark going with the C plus for his grade. I think that tracks a little bit for me. I think I might have had like a B minus B. It was just one of those games where, you never really felt stressed. You never really felt a little tense. They made the plays in the right spot to get off the field when they needed to. I think I just came away, feeling, very fine about things. I think that if they'd gone in and put it on them and covered that spread and won 38-6, like we saw, or like we thought they would, I think you would feel pretty good. But I think that you're still kind of in that area where you're like, okay, this is just building towards that next test. We are still waiting to see how you'll put everything together when you get to a USC or an Ohio State. Because I think that what they showed on Saturday, that physicality, how they went about winning that game in a way that wasn't necessarily pretty, but got the job done. I think that's a skill that you have to have. And I think that if you look at the first 5 games, you have that nice, comfortable blowout against Kent State. You have that, you're in the mud duking it out with someone like Bowling Green. You have a road win at West Virginia. You have a ranked team that came out, punched you in the mouth early, but you found your footing in Illinois. And that was on a bigger stage in prime time. I think that, UCLA was kind of the next building block, I guess, as you move forward. So I think that Penn State has really put together, while these individual performances might not be complete on Saturdays, I think the total product through 5 games in 6 weeks, I think paints a pretty complete picture. The last part of it, though, is these elite programs, these helmet games, these high level talented teams. Then what does it look like?
We've got some individual players to spotlight, some other storylines going into USC week we're going to get to out of James Franklin's press conference. But Mark, I want to throw it back to you because, again, 4 consecutive years where Penn State gets to early October at 5-0. This is the first time where the playoff field is 12, so it feels like you got more cushion than ever at 5-0. But as usual, when you get to 5-0, bigger tests are down the line, and what you're going to be judged on is down the line. And so maybe how would you compare and contrast this 5-0 to the other 3 versions that we've seen since 2021?
Ask me next week. I'll have a much better feel for that. But that's the thing. I think in each of those years, we thought the team was pretty good. What I would say is that, and I've written this, I think, in every one of my report cards when I have the intangible things. This, to me, there seems to be an overall level of confidence with this team on both sides of the ball and swagger, which is something we did not see from that offense, even in some of the years when they were playing really well. You might see it from a player or two, but I don't think you saw the overall thing. And that's where I go back to that block by Venga. I mean, to me, that kind of typifies or personifies what you've seen from this offense. Katron Allen's running, even though he's not as explosive as Nick Singleton, his running style, James Franklin talked about it as we taped this today, Monday. We talked to James Franklin earlier for his weekly press conference. He talked about what some of those runs and big hits by the offense do. First of all, when they happen on your sideline, but then when they happen on the other sideline. So we definitely saw that swagger the last couple of years from the defense under Manny Diaz, but now we're seeing it from the offense as well. And so I would say, and again, we'll have a better feel next week. I was only joking around that. I'll tell you next week. But listen, it's what was Mike Tyson's line? Everybody has a game plan until they get punched in the mouth. And it might happen this week. It might not happen this week, but it's going to happen at some point. And that's where the one thing I did want to go back and that I should have mentioned earlier is they cleaned up the penalties, which I really liked. But it's like every week there's some issue on special teams. This past week it was the punting, which is so weird because Riley Thompson was so consistent last year, but he averaged, less than, 35 or 36 yards per kick, had one deflected. And then on a punt return, they had 2 flags on one punt return, and then the slow starts. I mean, this is a pattern of slow starts, which again, you can get away with that when you're not playing, a top 10 team. But sooner or later, those things will come out and bite you. And that's where those are the things that are going to dictate whether this team gets to 6-0 and beyond, or whether it stubs its toe again. But going back to the whole 5-0 thing, it's like, yeah, well, it's not really that unique. I mean, I guess it is unique in that they're the only team that's done it over all these years, but the fact that you're typically playing multiple weaker opponents before you get into the Big Ten, and then once you get into the playing only Big Ten opponents, yeah, it's going to be more challenging. Of course, it's going to be more challenging.
Mark, as a Maryland alum who's watched his school go 4-0, 3-1, sometimes 5-0 in September and October, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Some of those have ended at the hands of Penn State, right? I mean,
exactly.
Yeah, the blackout that Friday night. Oh, yeah. But before we go down that road and you lead us down to College Park, Daniel, Mark made reference there to, sometimes you got the top 10 matchup shows up. We thought they might have a top 10 matchup this week. In fact, I believe on the postgame podcast Saturday, I called it a likely top 10 matchup. As it turns out, Penn State is going to travel to face an unranked USC team because of how they lost. I'm going to talk about that with you guys a little bit later, how this matchup and the dynamics nationally maybe look a little bit different than what we thought because of how things played out in Minneapolis on Saturday night. But let's go to the players of the game for UCLA and break down that group a bit. Because to Mark's point, the physicality has stood out with this offense. James Franklin said that side of the ball is bringing more physicality than he recalls seeing in recent seasons. The offensive line is the tip of the spear there, he said. But the wide receiver group, he pointed to him again today and talked about how if you went back and told everyone this is how they would perform through the first 5 games of the season, people would take it. And he says they still have room to grow. He thinks the group's going to get better. But the point that keeps popping up, Daniel, and I know that you were doing some research on this over the weekend, is in this case, Liam Clifford is the offensive player of the game. But there's been a case to be made for a different receiver almost every week. Harrison Wallace in week 1. Omari Evans has popped up with a 100-yard performance. Julian Fleming has made some big plays. And so when you focus on those 4 alone, there's a lot more to consider for opposing defenses than there were at 5-0 last year. So I know I'm throwing you more of a receiver topic than just a Liam Clifford note here as the offensive player of the week for Penn State staff, but I think it goes hand in hand.
Yeah, I think we talked about it a little bit with Liam on Saturday night, how he's averaging, I think, 22.5 yards per catch right now. And coming into the season, that wasn't really the MO for him. I think that if you said you had a receiver that would have 3 catches for 107 yards in a game, Clifford would probably be lower down the list on who you thought accomplished that feat. But I think when James Franklin talks about quote unquote balance, it goes beyond the just running and passing. I think that you can drill it down and distill it down to having different players involved, and then within that having different players involved in different ways. I think that to be such a well-rounded offense. But I was looking through some numbers on Sunday night, and Clifford's the 4th different receiver that Penn State has had go over 100 yards receiving through the first 5 games of the year.
I think Mike Yursich is outside, guys. Sorry, do you hear that? Somebody's backing a bus up. I don't know what's going on out there. I'm sorry. I was waiting for that for like 6 months.
I'm glad I could
you hear it
for you.
I heard there actually was a beeping bus, folks. So that was nicely timed. Daniel.
Sorry, Daniel.
No, you're good. But so you had Trey Wallace over 100 yards in week 1. You had Tyler Warren over 100 in week 2, Omari Evans against Kent State in game 3, and now you have Liam Clifford. Last year Penn State only had 2 receivers go over 100 yards in 13 games, and that was Keandre Lambert-Smith against West Virginia in week 1, and then Tyler Warren in the Peach Bowl against Ole Miss. So that bookended the season.
13 and game 1 last year.
Yeah, and Lambert-Smith had a couple good games. I think he had a 95-yard game, a 96-yard game, an 86-yard game too. But I'm not moving the goalposts. I'm keeping it at 100. And, that's the round number. That's the one everyone looks at. And then within that, Clifford's the 4th different receiver to lead Penn State in receiving yards in 5 games, as the guys I already mentioned. And Wallace has done it twice. I think he did it with like 34 yards or 38 yards against Illinois in that game. But last year they had in 13 games, they had 4 receivers lead them in receiving in a game. Lambert Smith was 7 times. Nick Singleton was like 3 times. Warren was twice, and Theo Johnson was once. And so I think that you're seeing that balance. You're seeing different guys step up. And that's what you need for Penn State. I had someone on, tweet at me or mention me on X, and they said that, after the game, in a post-game radio show, someone was saying that, oh, Penn State's actually harder to defend because they don't have a true number 1 wide receiver. And the question that was posited to me was, well, like, wouldn't you want like a Ryan Williams or Jeremiah Smith or Nick Marsh? And it's like, oh yeah, of course. Like, that's wide receiver is a position that you want to stockpile those elite guys. You want to have them, but Penn State doesn't have that elite guy. And so this is what you need when you don't have that elite guy that will be there every single week to perform, is that you need, your depth to step up, your depth to come through. And I think that's just a really, really encouraging sign from Penn State at this point in the season.
And I'm sure the counter argument from inside the Lash building was, "Hey, Daniel, we got a bunch of elite guys. It's just, you got to pick your poison. We can't showcase one every single week because we got too many options." And in terms of labeling anybody elite in this offense, I think certainly Tyler Warren is getting that stamp right now. And so when he is, doing what he's doing at tight end, that's going to take a lot of the load off of needing everything from the wide receiver group. But yeah, Harrison Wallace, 3 catches plus per game. The total yardage hasn't been huge, but more lately you're getting yardage from Liam Clifford that we haven't seen ever. We're getting some more yardage from Julian Fleming than you got through the first couple of games. Is it a 2 deep? Truly, not quite yet. It's really a 4-man show right now, wide receiver. It's been that way throughout. Guys like Tyler Johnson, maybe Tysier Denmark down the road, and Anthony Ivy trying to knock on that door right now. And Caden Saunders, last we saw is in a boot. But these 4 guys getting the job done, and Drew Aller been able to spread the wealth to them a bit. And defensive players of the game, they went with 2 for this one. Denied Dennis Sutton, who we spoke about going into the matchup. I named him my player of the game in part because he posted something on Twitter coming into the matchup about wanting everyone to know his name after the UCLA game. He didn't have a 6 sacks performance, but he was very disruptive, very active, basically shut down that UCLA scoring threat in the second quarter when they had to settle for a field goal after the big chunk play through the air on the pass to the running back. And then Zakee Wheatley, talk about shutting down a scoring threat. He was the man who came up with the 4th down stop on UCLA's long opening drive. He had a career high with 7 tackles. I thought he had a really strong day in pass coverage as well when he was targeted. And Mark, let's begin with Zakee Wheatley, because we've heard so many good things about him over the offseason, going into the summer. You want to know how it holds up. And once KJ Winston went down long-term, he became even more important. He was already a starter, but he became a guy that had to be a staple for you. How do you think he has responded in recent weeks? Because I thought he did his best job, and I don't want to shortchange him here. I felt like he was doing his best KJ Winston impersonation at times on Saturday against UCLA, the way he was out there tackling with authority in the open field.
Yeah, the only thing that's missing are the turnovers, right? He's been a turnover king so many times, and I think those are going to come. I do. I think they're going to come as Penn State continues to get more pressure on opposing quarterbacks. But he's been great. I mean, this is a kid who, told us, and the coaching staff told us that he took things as seriously as ever in the offseason. They challenged him to get better, and he did. And thankfully for them, he did. I think the other part of it is Dejon Lane. I mean, the fact that they were able to play him, I have your snaps up here, 30 snaps. And, what does that do for you? It allows you to put Jalen Reed up closer to the line, and we all know what he's about. So when we talk about defensive players of the game, I don't know how they come up with these things, because I think they're getting great play kind of all around. I mean, I don't know how you keep Zane Durant off of that list. I mean, I know he only had 2 tackles and half a sack, but that guy's a disruptor in the middle of the line. I know we're going to talk about him a little later, but I mean, he's another guy. So, again, I mentioned Jalen Reed and what he can do in all those different areas. I just think that they're getting some outstanding play in all these different areas, which is a good problem to have. When it's difficult to pick your player of the week, and I think it was difficult on both sides. That's not a knock on Liam. I mean, he had a great game, But, I thought Aller played well. I thought Katron, again, didn't have the big yards per carry, but sent a message. So I think on both sides of the ball, when it's not easy to figure out who your players of the week are, I think that's a positive for this team.
Yeah, it was a balanced effort. It's been a balanced effort, it feels like, for this defense the last few seasons, and that's been reflected in the stats a lot of times as well. But when we talk about what you mentioned, Dejon Lane, what you're able to accomplish if Lane is truly ready to be that regular, consistent piece of the puzzle on defense. And James Franklin referenced it today. He's talked about it a couple times since KJ Winston went out with an injury. Being able to go with Lane and Wheatley back deep and have Jalen Reed play in the box as that line kind of role. And he's been playing in the box a lot more the last couple of weeks than he did initially coming out of KJ Winston's injury. And Lane goes from 6 snaps in the Big Ten opener to 30 snaps in their second conference game. I think that really sends a message about where they want to get him. I think he's still got things to work on. I think that was evident during the course of the game. You can see he's got that freshman nature to him in some ways, but a lot to like about his physical makeup. And as he gains this experience, by the way, 3 Penn State freshmen officially burned redshirt status on Saturday. Offensive lineman Cooper Cousins, Lane, and then tight end Luke Reynolds. We did see Vabu Torre get some action at safety as well. His second game of action. Quentin Martin got in for his second game of action at running back. Over at Dennis Sutton, and putting the spotlight on him for a moment, he had a couple quarterback hurries. He was credited with a couple pass breakups. Like I said, he was huge on multiple plays when UCLA was trying to maybe tie the game up at 7-7 in the second quarter. And additionally, when you kind of tack that on to what Abdul Carter has shown, he had another sack and another tackle and a half for loss. That number is steadily rising for him. How do you feel about the way Penn State's going into this long-awaited matchup against USC from the standpoint of those 2 edge rushers that we have highlighted so much of 2024?
I think I would feel pretty good about them. I know that we were waiting a little bit to get.
I think Daniel froze up.
Oh, yep. Daniel froze for just a moment here. Let's see if we get him back. If we don't, we'll get him back soon.
I think we just leave it like that. We don't need him.
Yeah, Daniel's looking pretty good there. We'll work on getting Daniel back. But Mark, I guess I can pose the same question to you. When Denai's getting rolling like this, we got Daniel. Okay, Daniel, I just throw right back to you. We didn't get any of your answer, but you got a second shot here.
Did the bus show up at your house?
I mean, maybe it was Yursich coming for me after that. No, let me see. Okay, the internet's back. It's stabilized. Yeah, I think that this is what you need to see at this point, going into a game against a program like USC, where you know what they like to do. You know how they like to do it. I know that I'm a big proponent of, like, quarterback hurries are nice, pressures are nice. We saw Dennis Sutton, like, have 2 quarterback hurries, 2 pass breakups that, ended drives or whatever. But I really do maintain that getting a sack is a completely different thing, and that you need sacks if you want to win games. That just how important they are. And we've seen those. So I think I would feel really good about that production. I think you're seeing Tom Allen move Abdul Carter around a little bit. He's doing that rushing from the second level, getting that running start. You've seen them flip sides. We've seen Dennis Sutton rush from the inside on occasion, I think. They have that package with only 1 defensive tackle and 3 defensive ends on the field. So they are doing different things to get different matchups and, give these opposing offenses a little bit more to think about. So I feel good about them. I think that this is the type of game where if you get the quarterback onto the ground, if you get some hits on him, if you, on a second down, you get a sack to put a team into 3rd and long. That's really big. And, we saw against Illinois what happens when you put a team back, get them out of what they want to do and force them to have to throw the ball. When you know that they're going to throw the ball, how things can really snowball. And so I think I like where this Penn State pass rush is right now.
Hey, don't forget about Amin Vanover, guys. I mean,
yes,
I was going to just mention that because Dennis Sutton and Abdul Carter had 4 pressures on Saturday. Amin Vanover had 5 pressures on Saturday, and he's been a pretty consistent presence in this rotation for multiple seasons now. But his availability was an issue last year for a couple different reasons at different stints. Now that he's getting consistent work, Mark, you're right. He has really been an important piece of what they need to accomplish off the edge.
Yeah, imagine you're an offensive tackle. Well, you guys are too small. I'm actually too small to do that. But
I played offensive tackle. I got.
Imagine if you're a major
wrap my
college
head around this
football
one.
offensive tackle, or an offensive tackle at Penn State, not Rutgers. There you go. Does that work?
That works.
No, but in all seriousness, you're going up against Abdul Carter and Denai Dennis Sutton. And, these guys are both a handful. Abdul Carter, super fast, Denai, 270 pounds. And then one of those guys takes a break, and here comes Amin Vanover. I mean, that guy is going to be starting at most programs in the nation. And to me, you talked about his availability last year, but he's really elevating his game overall. And to be able to have him as that third guy, and then Smith Vilbert, who I think we could still see some more from him in terms of just improving his play a little bit overall. I think he's been good, but he's not been at that elite level. I think Amin Vanover's getting toward that. He's not quite there, but to have him coming off the bench against guys who are getting worn down a little bit, wow, that's got to be a handful.
One other Amin Vanover point that I think something he apparently deserves credit for was I watched a little bit of Drew Aller's appearance on the podcast with Devon J. Thomas and Aeneas Hawkins, and they asked Drew Aller about how much he's been talking this year and some of his confidence. And Aller had told us before that going up against the defense, it kind of put him in the position where he had to talk, he had to say something, he had to talk that trash. But on the podcast, he said that it was Amin Vanover was the one who was talking to him enough. And it finally got Aller to the point where, he had to say something, he had to break out of his shell a little bit. So I think that adds a little bit more to that type of player you get when Amin Vanover is on the field.
Yeah, that good insight there, and a nice little assist from Amin, and shout out to those guys who have a lot of fun with their podcast as well. Daniel and Mark, Ryan Barker was the selection on special teams, and obviously that's a good indication. You're coming out of a matchup last week, and a place kicker is the pick for special teams player of the week from this coaching staff. Barker, perfect on his extra point opportunities. More importantly, hit a 40-yard field goal and also a 25-yard field goal after Penn State had trouble getting it through the uprights. I asked James Franklin a little bit more for background on how he got to this point with Ryan Barker during the Monday press conference, and I caught up with him earlier this offseason, and I'm going to have a story up on Tuesday morning at Lions247.com with more on Barker. But he comes from a different background, Mark. We had Jake Pinniger, who was, a highly rated kicker, had a lot of opportunities at the FBS level. Sanders Sahadak was considered the number one kicker in 24/7 Sports rankings in the 2021 cycle. Alex Felkins was already the all-time leading scorer for the Columbia football program before he made the jump to Big Ten football and finished out with Penn State last year. Barker's a guy who did not have anyone circling the wagons really around him as a scholarship type guy coming out of Eastern Pennsylvania, and he got a walk-on opportunity through some conversations, through the relationship building with the staff, and ultimately through some camp exposure with Penn State, where he showed up last year. And just as we heard throughout the offseason last year, and Franklin mentioned it this time, he put himself in a position to really compete for the job as a true freshman walk-on. It didn't happen. Felkins ends up getting the second crack at it. He takes it and runs with it. But now Ryan Barker has the reins of this thing, Mark, and I'd imagine if he keeps going, if he keeps taking the proper steps, he could have this job for a very long time in Happy Valley. What do you make of this opportunity for Barker and Penn State turning the keys over to a new kicker? Because me and Daniel talked about that a lot on Saturday, but we have not heard from you. And obviously, we've all been involved with discussions about that being a concern for Penn State's playoff push.
Yeah, I think we're all on record addressing how classy Sanders Sahadak was in dealing with the situation last year and talking to us this year before the most recent situation where he kind of lost a job. And I'm sure he won't be anything other than classy in dealing with it moving forward. So I just want to give a shout out, because sometimes these are difficult things to discuss, and nobody's rooting against Sahadak, but they had to go in a different direction, right? I mean, they had no choice, because Sahadak had proven in practice that he could get the job done, but he had clearly was unable to do it consistently in a game. And that's where I think, okay, now Barker did it for one game. Now he's got to stack games, or you're right back where you started, right? I mean, if he goes out to USC and is one of three, then you have a real issue. If he goes out and is 3 of 3, or 3 of 4, or whatever it might be, It's just a matter of having to repeat it over and over and over again and be consistent. And that's the one thing Franklin said about Barker today or Monday when we talked to him, that he has a knack for putting the ball straight down the middle every single time. Now, I don't know how that corresponds to the fact that Sahadak had a higher percentage of makes. I mean, that doesn't seem to kind of square, but in practice. But he got in the game, he got his opportunity and made the most of it. Now the other thing is he gambled on himself, right? I'm sure he could have gone somewhere else and had a clear path to the starting job, but he gambled on himself and now it's paying off. Now he's got to make the most of it. One other thing about Barker, I was down on the field at the end of the Illinois game and he was down there warming up and I was struck by how big he is. I mean, he's not, as big as the offensive lineman or anything, but they have him at 6'2", 195, and he's every bit of that. I mean, he's a big physical kid. And, I don't know how that impacts you as a kicker. He's not Gabe Nwosu big, but he's big enough. And I just thought, Franklin had mentioned today how his physical size impressed them when they were first looking at him and that he came in really prepared. So this is a guy who gambled on himself, put himself in the best position to make the most of the opportunity when it came. It arrived. He made the most of it, but now you got to do it over and over and over again.
Yeah, Franklin talked about the consistency. He also mentioned his ability to flush bad moments quickly, and that we haven't seen that play out in the game, but Franklin acted like he has seen that play out on the practice field before, and that kind of matches with what we heard from new special teams coordinator Justin Lustig coming out of spring camp. By the way, James Franklin said coming out of spring camp, Ryan Barker was probably the favorite for the job. He was probably the favorite for the job early in the summer, and then Sanders Sahadak came on to take it before game one. But Lustig told us back in April that very much like a high-quality golf player, Ryan Barker could, have a bad swing, and then he would just move on and finish the rest of the round really strong. And so, hey, that's what we haven't seen from Sanders Sahadak. We've talked about the leg talent, we've talked about the recruiting pedigree, but we haven't seen him really bounce back from misses in game action. And so we'll see how that psychological aspect comes up. Although I'm sure Nittany Lions fans will be fine not seeing that test pop up for a while. The longer Barker can go without missing one. Let's get into the Nick Singleton update that came our way from James Franklin, and probably got more than maybe some people anticipated we would to begin this week for USC. But James Franklin was pretty candid. We addressed this during the post-game podcast about what happened from his perspective on Saturday, and that he expected Nick Singleton to be available when they got to Beaver Stadium. He thought that would be the case when they went back into the locker room after pregame warmups, and then it wasn't. The head athletic trainer and then running backs coach Jaywan Slater came to him before kickoff, let him know that Nick was not going to be available. And we talked about it before. Drew Aller, running out in the field for that first possession, didn't know that Nick Singleton was not available. So it all happened very quickly. And so James Franklin said it was so close to playing last Saturday that they entered this week very confident. And that's coming off a conversation he said he had with Nick Singleton on Sunday. They're very confident that he's going to be able to go play against USC, barring any kind of setback. Again, the nature of the situation and why he missed his first ever college game, not disclosed right now. But Nick Singleton, who was a pretty important piece of this offense for the first 30 games of his career, Mark, to get him back in this setting against USC, national showcase kind of game, and potentially a little bit better rested than he certainly would have been if he gave it a go against the Bruins. Maybe for all the drama that's kind of surfaced on Saturday afternoon, the silver lining is you're going to get maybe the best version or a better version of Nick Singleton in this kind of a matchup. Yeah,
I thought it was smart that they erred on the side of caution there. Why? I mean, why would you – I'm not going to suggest that was going to be, some sort of easy game no matter what, but you have a good enough running back in Katron Allen. And, let's see what we're going to see out of Quentin Martin. I actually wish we would have seen him carry the ball a little bit more just to see what he's like. He caught a pass, did a nice job there. But I don't think you want to risk that, knowing how important that this guy is. And I think we saw it in the game. I mean, when he's not out there, that's one less explosive weapon that the opponent has to account for. And that's going to be important when they get into these games against the best teams on their schedule. UCLA clearly wasn't one of the best teams on their schedule.
Yeah, and we mentioned this on the post-game podcast. Katron Allen, longest run of the day for anybody, 11 yards. No one had beyond that had a run longer than 5 yards on the day. So you were sorely missing that Nick Singleton field stretching component on the ground. Sounds like they're going to get it back against USC. And to get out to Los Angeles and the Coliseum to play this matchup, they're going to take a different approach. Daniel, you've got a story fresh up at Lions 24/7. Exploring a lot of commentary from James Franklin, not just about what they're going through this week to make this happen, but now that the Pac-12 transplants are here to stay in the Big Ten, and these trips are going to need to happen on an annual basis, he has some ideas about what needs to happen in University Park right here in central Pennsylvania.
Yeah, everyone's favorite topic came up, the length of the airport runway, which is, I guess on the Penn State beat is standard fare for the head football coach's news conference. Yeah, Penn State, the way that they want to get out to Los Angeles and the type of plane they want to use, they can't fly out of State College because the runway is too short. So they'll be driving down to Harrisburg on Thursday and then going out to LA. Franklin said they're leaving a day early, partly just because of how long everything is going to take. That drive to the airport can be he said 2 hours. Some people in my mentions said that it's only 90 minutes or it's only hour 45, but I think in a bus transporting 100 some people, it's probably going to take a while. So then you add that to a 5.5 hour flight. It just makes an entire travel day. So they wanted to get out there a day early. They'll practice out there and then get ready for Saturday. So Franklin said that when this was something that he brought up when USC and UCLA joined the Big Ten, that Penn State isn't close to an international airport. And he said that in the Northeast, he implied like the implications that Rutgers is close to Newark, or you can get to Newark from Rutgers. Maryland is close to BWI. These are places that are close to these airports where you can get those on those planes to make those cross country flights with all the people in one plane. On Friday before the UCLA game, there were 2 planes that came in from LAX. I think I heard that maybe some other West Coast teams will take 2 planes when they come east to other places just because of the logistics. But something else that came up a little bit in passing, but we didn't really get into it with Franklin on Monday, was the sport science aspect of it, the changing time zones. We talked to Josh Nelson last summer. So this is summer 2023, still a year out from these teams joining. I don't even think we knew Oregon and Washington were going to join yet. And at that point, Josh Nelson, who was the associate AD of sports performance, I think, or something along those lines, he said that they had already been trying to figure out the right plan for how to do a trip to the West Coast. For the bowl games, Penn State goes out there like 5 days early. You do all the festivities, you get used to it. But this is an in and out. This is a very NFL style trip. So Josh Nelson said last year that they're talking to NFL teams. Franklin said that again today, and they're going to attempt to keep their routine as normal as possible. We know how routine oriented Franklin and this program is, so it'll be interesting to see how exactly this shows when we get to Saturday.
And I know that the team isn't the only group trying to adjust to an October trip out to Los Angeles in the middle of Big Ten play. This media beat has had its hands full adjusting to the new realities of the Big Ten schedule. But you will both be out there in Southern California heading out on Friday, and we'll have you stationary by the end of the day, I think, and then ready for action on Saturday in Los Angeles.
Hey, just so you guys know,
yeah.
I mean, for all this complaining about runways and whatnot, when Penn State played in the Rose Bowl in 1923, it was my first year on the beat. They had to take a train out there. So it could be a lot worse. They could be going, James, you could be going by train out to the LA Memorial Coliseum, like that great 1923 team that I covered. It was my first year on the beat.
Yeah, they must have left on a Sunday morning back then to get out there for a Saturday matchup. That's a heck of a story. And Mark, I do want to mention Zane Durant here because James Franklin really had a lot to say about him. It's not the first time that's happened this season, and we've all acknowledged that he has truly taken a step forward. That was really the forecast for him in preseason camp. From a lot of the feedback we were getting from the Lash building, it has shown up on the field on a regular basis. And Franklin went so far as to say he doesn't remember the last time they had a defensive tackle who was this disruptive. He also said it has created new opportunities for them from what they can do at that edge rusher position. What has Zane Durant done maybe to recalibrate the imagination of what this defense can be and what this defense can accomplish?
He's drawing a lot of focus from the opposing offensive lines. And if you're forced to double team him or go out of your way to address him, because one, he's super athletic. He's not the hugest guy in the world, but he's gotten much bigger since he's been here. I don't have the roster up in front of me, but is he like 295 at this point? So he's big and he's fast. And, the key for him now is he's shown it against, I don't want to say lesser teams, but he's shown it against the team so far. He's in a position where if he keeps this up, he has an opportunity to make himself a lot of money. I don't think a lot of people going into this season, when they were looking at third-year players, possibly going into the NFL draft, I don't think he was at the top of the list of a lot of Penn State fans thinking about that. But this next stretch, this next month is going to be huge for Zane Durant. And if he plays at the level he's playing, that's going to help Penn State football. And guess who else it's going to help? It's going to help Zane Durant. So I think the fact that he's drawing that much attention, if he can keep that up, that they're forced to have multiple guys deal with him. And as you mentioned, when that's happening, okay, now you have one less person to deal with Dennis Sutton or to deal with Abdul Carter or to deal with Jalen Reed blitzing, or to deal with Amin Vanover. I mean, that's what a great defensive tackle is able to do. Sometimes you see guys like Aaron Donald who are able to, and I'm not comparing him apples to apples there, but Aaron Donald is a guy who was able to put up tremendous stats himself. But I think what Zane Durant is doing, I think he's a classic example of somebody who's making everybody around him better.
Yeah, I think the emergence of two interior linemen on this team into kind of star status right now has changed how we view it in the trenches. Zane Durant on the defensive side, Vega Ioane, redshirt sophomore, what he's doing at guard, what he's doing all over the field right now for this team. I wanted to finish with some conversation about how Penn State comes out of this past weekend, because there's a lot of programs out there right now not looking so pretty after what went down on Saturday afternoon and Saturday night. And you've seen the carnage reflected in the AP Top 25 poll. And as a result, Penn State able to jump from number 7 to number 4. Daniel, you had a story up on lines247.com on Sunday exploring how Penn State's future opponents were impacted. But generally speaking, how would you kind of characterize the Nittany Lions coming off a win that maybe around here some people were perhaps underwhelmed by in some ways, but nationally it's a 16-point win over UCLA at home? How does Penn State look right now comparatively when you see a lot of damage done across college football?
I think that they're going to have a lot of eyeballs on them now. I think to see them move up into that top 5, I think that a lot of times when you're in that 6 to 10 range, there's a lot of things that can be interchangeable. Like it's more of, I feel like, a mess when you're down there. But when you're in that top 5, I mean, that's really where the cutoff is. I know that in the past we would look at number 4 and say, oh, they're in that college football playoff cutoff. In the 4-team era. But I think that Penn State's in good shape. I think even though USC isn't going to have the number next to their name anymore on Saturday because of their loss to Minnesota, they are unofficially 26th in both the AP and the coaches poll. I think a lot of people are going to be curious because I think coming into the year, Penn State was a little bit under the radar. I think that they're a team that, from a national perspective, that a lot of people feel like they have a read on. Like, it's a good team that can't beat Ohio State or Michigan. And then you add in Oregon to the mix from the Pac-12. That's a team with national championship aspirations. Ohio State loaded up in the portal this offseason. Michigan was the defending champion. I think that Penn State was not an afterthought, but definitely under the radar for a lot of people coming into the year. And suddenly they're up there at number 4. They're going to have a nationally televised game at a marquee program like USC with a lot of eyeballs on it on Saturday on CBS. And I think that this is their chance to really put, their best foot forward. I know that they were in that NBC primetime slot on 2 weeks ago against Illinois, but you were playing opposite Alabama and Georgia. I know that you were in that big noon slot on Saturday against UCLA, and a lot of people saw that, but that's UCLA. This is going to be that CBS 3:30. A lot of people are going to be watching. This is regarded as one of the better Saturday slates in college football in a while. So I think there's some excitement around it, and they're in a very, very good spot. James Franklin talks about it. At the end of a Saturday, there's a lot of programs out there that wish they would have won. Penn State's been able to do that every week, and this is the next challenge. And I think that if they win, they'll be looked at maybe a little bit differently nationally.
I'm very curious to see what kind of USC team shows up to that stadium on Saturday, because that could be a very deflated team. Picking up their second loss of the season. They're starting to feel more like the team we anticipated they might be coming into the Big Ten. A little too lean on the offensive line in terms of the strength up there, being able to dictate games, just really not being able to show up in that big stage like that in a key situations against Minnesota. You wonder how it's going to hold over against how we've discussed this defensive front. A team that's 5-7 in the last 12 games. I know that's a stat that's been thrown out a bunch this week regarding Lincoln Riley. There's going to be a lot of eyeballs on this game, not just to see who is Penn State, but people want to see, is this USC's demise? Or is this about to be a spiral for this storied program when Lincoln Riley showed up in the private jet and all these bells and whistles from Oklahoma? So, yeah, this is going to be a game people are paying close attention to. I think there's a little bit of a loss from the wind behind the sails that you might get from a win over USC now. If they were number 8 or number 9 in the country, which I think they would have been if they won, it's a whole different ballgame in terms of national perception. Now it's an unranked team, and you're expected to go out there and win. I think the line opened at 4 at favoring Penn State. Last I checked, it was up to 5.5. So home underdog there for USC. And by the way, I told you this coming out of the stadium, Daniel. If Penn State wins against USC going into their bye week, I think then the expectation solidly becomes getting a home playoff game, because you think about the way that college football playoff is shaping up and picking up a loss, even if you project them to lose against Ohio State, which I know a lot of people are going to do until they actually beat the Buckeyes. Even one loss, you think you probably have a chance to play a game here the weekend before Christmas against an opponent in the first round of the playoffs. So really could set them up for a second half with just the kind of expectations, realistic expectations, it would seem, that we just haven't seen here in State College with that playoff expansion. Mark, your idea was to bring up our bold predictions at the end of each following Monday. We've been doing it. It's been validating for some of us at times. It's been embarrassing at others. You're going to lead us off this time. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, all three of us, we predicted Penn State to win comfortably enough to cover that 4-touchdown spread. They won pretty comfortably, but not quite that enough. So we were combined 0-for-3 against Las Vegas this past game.
Yeah, I had A.J. Harris with a pick 6, making up for the one that was sort of taken away from him. Not taken away from him. I mean, it was that not so wise penalty cost him on a teammate against Illinois, and it didn't happen. There was one play where I thought he had an opportunity to do something, but he just couldn't quite pull it off. So I was wrong on A.J. Harris. I'm definitely not this week's winner.
Daniel, what do you have?
I drew Aller over 300 yards with 4 touchdowns. I am a little bit surprised that Penn State didn't really attack that UCLA secondary as much as the numbers might have suggested, and they kept it on the ground and shortened the game, which I appreciated in terms of playoff baseball viewing. But Aller finishes 17-24, 237, 1 touchdown, and I'll be back at it next week. I'll be bold, and as soon as I hit on one of these, I'll look really, really smart.
You appreciated it at the moment, Daniel. You did not appreciate it during said playoff baseball game.
Did not appreciate it in the top of the 8th inning.
I had at least 3 Penn State players rushing for more yards than UCLA collectively did. That was a big swing and a miss. I did anticipate that Nick Singleton was going to play. I also thought there was going to be more Bro Perbula because of the scoreboard. Neither of those things happened, so that really hurt my case. And then Katron Allen, even with 21 carries, 78 yards, still just alone would have been shy of USC's rushing total. They were about 40 over their season average on Saturday. And to Franklin's point, they may have found a quarterback in Justin Martin. We'll follow UCLA moving forward. But USC is the team now in the spotlight for Penn State. We'll be back on the practice field on Wednesday, get another look at this team. Anthony Donka is someone we'll be monitoring. He was not brought up during the press conference. He did not finish the final few quarters of that game in Beaver Stadium on Saturday at right tackle. And we will be back with an episode midweek before that practice, though. We'll have a USC insider to break down how things are shaping up for the 3-2 Trojans out there in Los Angeles. We'll bring Tyler Calvaruso back on. A lot of recruiting coverage over at Lions247.com from this past weekend, and more to come. So we'll have Tyler on to break down the latest there. For now, big thanks to you, Mark. Big thanks to you, Daniel. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.